The next model, which is prevalent, and by the way, unlike the no-model model, there are times this model is appropriate. It's been called the expert model. Now, this is the traditional model of supervision in medicine. And during the supervisory process, supervisees are asked to report what they've done with their patients, and the supervisors critique these actions and make corrective suggestions. And the whole approach has a right and a wrong way to do it. So, tell me about your work with Mrs. Smith. Supervisee tells about Mrs. Smith, and the supervisor says, well, that's well done because you followed evidence-based practices in depression and you did CBT. However, you failed to do blah, blah, blah. So it's like it becomes a game about how do you make your supervisor happy. Now, especially for supervisees who are fearful of criticism and negative judgment, they're going to be very good at this game, and they're going to edit and or be very selective in what they discuss with this type of expert supervisor, and they might even avoid supervision altogether, unless it's like a real emergency, because they don't want to be yelled at. Now, with the expert model, it is at times appropriate for beginners who don't really know what they're doing. But it absolutely should not be used as the only model for delivery of clinical supervision across developmental lines. It's pretty much only appropriate if then, at the very beginning stage. There's also a one-size-fits-all model. In this approach, the clinical supervisors consider themselves in charge, and as a result, they direct all the activities of their supervisees under their care, regardless of expertise and level of experience. This is the example I was giving before about supervisors who say, I don't know what the big deal is. They come in, I tell them what to do, they go out and do it. I evaluate them on how well they did it. And they do that with first-year practicum, second-year practicum, pre-doctoral interns, postdocs, even faculty that they're supervising. It doesn't matter to them. I know what I'm doing. I tell you what to do. Your job is to go out and do it. That's a example of a one-size-fits-all model. And you can see where it's not respecting the person in front of you. It definitely is not collaborative, and it violates a host of the foundational kinds of practices that we were just talking about. Now we're getting down to some of the more efficacious models. Now, this model has come to be referred to as the relational or the interactional model. The main assumption within this model is that supervision is a reciprocal relationship based on mutuality of needs. So within this particular template, the supervisor and supervisee both understand that relationship issues between them and supervision are going to impact client care in the manner that we talked about before when we talked about parallel process, countertransference. So a second assumption here is that the supervisory relationship is the medium, it's the vehicle through which supervision actually occurs. So the goal here is to create an atmosphere of safety, of trust, of learning, and understanding the appropriate role of both power and authority and where it lies. So within this relationship model, you pay attention to how the relationship is going and how it's changing over time. Another model, which, by the way, is not necessarily mutually exclusive, but another way of looking at it is the integrated developmental model, or IDM. Here, a stage model is assumed in terms of supervisee professional development. So it's assumed they're going to go through various stages in their attempts to become a full-blown licensed professional. It also assumes the supervisor, the supervisee, and the supervisory relationship will change in quality over time. There's a need to customize supervision based on a level of development. The parallel to this is parenting, right? You're going to parent a toddler very differently than you would a school-age child, very differently than you would a very young teenager, middle teenager, older teenager, young adult. They all call for different parenting at different stages. In a parallel way, this model postulates that we as supervisors need to customize our approach based upon the developmental level, the professional developmental level of our supervisees. So, by definition, it takes a systems approach on supervision. The goal is a development of trainees' understanding of themselves and how they can best help their clients. So, a corollary of these assumptions is you need to assess and intervene as a supervisor at different levels of supervisee development across various domains. So it's easiest to use an integrative approach with this model because this model lays out a process, and the content can be of your supervision can be supplied for any theoretical model that you and your supervisee choose. So it could be used for attachment theory, object relations, interpersonal, CBT, existential humanistic, psychoeducational, whatever you want. Stoltenberg has been the most vocal proponent of this model. He's been working on it for decades. And what he has proposed, he's done some excellent work, is 3 overriding structures that monitor trainee development through 3 levels. These 3 structures are, these 3 processes are, awareness of self and others. Now, awareness of self and others, the reason he chose the word awareness, because according to Stoltenberg, it has both cognitive and affective components. So you have to be aware of both. Awareness of yourself and others, your motivation, and what he calls autonomy. And each of these processes is assessed across 3 levels of development, which he very nicely calls levels 1, 2, and 3, which roughly correspond to beginning, middle, and advanced levels of development. So, these 3 overriding structures represent areas where trainees change over the course of their development. So let's get into the 3 a little bit. Self and other awareness indicates where the trainee is in terms of self-preoccupation, awareness of the client's world, and insightful self-awareness. We'll get into this more in 1 minute. The cognitive component of the self and other awareness includes both the quality and content of the thought processes. For example, how does your trainee, does your supervisee accomplish case conceptualization in a way that respects their client, and how they go about their problem formulation. The affective component of self and other awareness refers to the trainee's emotional experience that changes as they develop. So what this looks like is self and other awareness. Level 1, the beginning kind of stages, the cognition that they'll have is very limited self-awareness. Affective, performance anxiety. Oh my God, what if I screw up? I have to do this right. So for those of you who have had the experience of supervising a brand new psychologist who's a practicum student, it's their very first practicum, man, they hold on to that intake sheet like it was the Holy Grail. If they're in this stage and deeply anxious. And they're just going to read it and make sure that they get through this piece of paper, right? So they're much more aware of how anxious they are, and it's almost, they can almost be doing it to an empty chair because they're not taking into account the patient's reactions at all. Okay, so that'd be level 1. limited self-awareness, and high anxiety. Level 2, which is the middle level of development, intermediate, the cognition, they are able to focus on the client and get out of themselves, and they understand the perspective of their client. And affectively, empathy is finally possible. If, back to level 1, if they're mostly focused on how anxious they are, and I have to do this intake correctly, you can't be empathic with the person sitting across from you. But at level 2, because you're taking their world into account, you can be empathic and try to understand what's going on and contributing to their being so unhappy or broken. And then at the advanced stage, the cognition is acceptance and awareness of the strengths and weaknesses in both themselves as supervisees and the strengths and weaknesses of the client. And affectively, they're much more aware of their own reactions and having empathy. So here's where they might be more aware that, oh, this person reminds me of Aunt Matilda, and I hate Aunt Matilda. But they're not Aunt Matilda, and I'll work on my relationship with Aunt Matilda later. Right now I'm working with this person who is not Aunt Matilda. Because as I learned in statistics, two things not same are different. So reminding them that they're aware that the situations may be similar but have important differences. Going on to the second process, which is motivation, according to Stoltenberg. Here, they're referring to the trainee's interest, investment, and effort that they're expending in clinical practice. So level 1, they start really motivated. All right? They're going to read everything. They're going to come back with piles of research articles on what they think might be going on with the patient. Now, level 2, when they get to be intermediate, Stoltenberg argues that supervisees here tend to fluctuate between high and low motivation, high and low confidence, and lack of confidence. I'm never going to get this. This is so complicated. It's, God, I don't know how anybody deals with depressed people all the time. It's like, oh, God, right? So here they're going to fluctuate. So if they're not doing well with the client, because they don't have a lot of experience, I'm the worst therapist in the world. I'm never going to get this. And if they happen to have a good experience where they did something well, it's like, I am God's gift to therapy. I am terrific. So they're going to fluctuate because they don't have a lot of experience. That's why they're still intermediate. Then for level 3, Stoltenberg argues that in this advanced stage of motivation, of course you have doubts about yourself, but those doubts do not immobilize you. Your professional identity is the primary focus, and you're moving towards a professional identity being established. Listen, now that I've had some experience, I know that I am excellent at evaluations. I'm excellent at feedback, helping people take in that feedback and then act appropriately. And that's where I want to focus my identity. I really want to do evaluations because the therapy aspect doesn't impress me that much. Right? Then for autonomy, what Stoltenberg argues is that this factor addresses a degree of dependence or independence that's demonstrated by your trainee over time. And always important to assess this over different domains, right? So autonomous, and we'll get into this in a moment, autonomy in evaluation, autonomy in case conceptualization, autonomy in choosing interventions, but we'll get into that. So level one in autonomy, they're very dependent, they have a very high need for structure. So your supervisee comes in and says, I have this lady and I don't know what to do, so you have to tell me, right? Level 2, they tend to have, according to Stoltenberg, a dependency or autonomy conflict. And at times they're overly assertive or they're overly compliant, and they tend to bounce between the two. And level 3 has appropriate degree of conditional dependency. So they're mostly autonomous, So this would be like at a postdoc level, for example. And then moving towards appropriate autonomy across all of the domains.